What goes up must come down. And though some MMA fighters make it out of there unscathed, for these guys, watching their declines was truly difficult at the worst of times. These are MMA's ugliest career declines. Chuck Liddell. You know that something's truly awry when UFC President Dana White is actively trying to get you to retire. And for the Iceman Chuck Liddell, that's exactly what it came to. After his title reign was brought to an end by Quinton Rampage Jackson. After losing his belt by first-round KO, before a 1-1 stretch left him with a real mountain to climb within the 205-pound division. However, things went from bad to worse for Liddell, as he suffered a trio of knockout losses in a row, eventually forcing Dana White to step in and strongly suggest that he hang up his gloves. Thankfully, Liddell did just that, accepting a ceremonial role within the UFC that would keep him in retirement for the next 8 years. Unfortunately, in what was one of the most widely criticized events in the history of the sport, Oscar de la Hoya's Golden Boy Promotions brought Liddell back to the cage for one final outing, matching him up with his old rival Tito Ortiz. Both men were aging veterans, but Ortiz was by far the more active fighter of the two, and in a truly ugly but short encounter, knocked Liddell out in the opening round. He then proceeded to alienate the masses even further by celebrating as if he had just won UFC gold. Jeez, Tito, read the room. Tony Ferguson. Perhaps it's unfair to place Tony Ferguson in the same category as some of these other stories, but even after just 3 consecutive defeats inside the octagon, watching El Cucuy compete has been something different entirely. Known usually for his uniquely creative and reckless style of fighting, Tony's most recent stretch has seen him unusually flat in his output, uninspired in moments that would have usually allowed him to blossom. And though Ferguson is as revered as any lightweight of his era, the damage he sustained at the hands of the great Justin Gaethje really did seem to change him. All of a sudden, the only remnant of his best performances seemed to be his ridiculous toughness, something that made watching him survive shot after shot much more difficult for his fans. Even those back-to-back submissions he thwarted against Charles Oliveira and Beneil Dariush were tough to experience because of the fact that he was realistically only surviving for the sake of surviving. Looking increasingly incapable of building momentum with each passing fight, even if it would be foolish to completely rule Ferguson out, we'd be lying if we said that we've enjoyed this most recent stretch of poor form. An Octagon legend with a spot in the UFC Hall of Fame all but guaranteed, here's hoping that he can find a way to overturn this ongoing decline. Antonio Bigfoot Silva. Though he never managed to capture UFC gold, Antonio Bigfoot Silva has done it all, and he's been in there with the greatest heavyweights to have ever competed. A gargantuan man by any metric, Silva endeared himself to the fans through his reputation as a warrior and his ability to upset the odds. When he was discounted by Alistair Overeem as little more than a stepping stone to the title, Bigfoot made him eat his words with a thunderous third-round knockout. When the great Fedor Emelianenko attempted to bounce back from a shocking submission defeat at the hands of Fabricio Verdum, Silva managed to completely dominate and finish him. And who can forget his brutal war with Mark Hunt, a fight that is regarded as the single greatest in heavyweight history. The issue with Antonio Silva was not one that was found within his earliest years. Unfortunately, the sheer amount of damage he had taken over the course of his many high-level heavyweight bouts eventually added up, leading to a major decline in his career's second half. Out of his last 10 outings, Bigfoot has gotten his hand raised just once, suffering 8 knockout losses in that time, not counting another TKO he sustained at the hands of Gabriel Gonzaga as a bare-knuckle boxer. Still competing under promotions in both Russia and Eastern Europe, this former UFC heavyweight title challenger has unfortunately absorbed a ridiculous amount of punishment over the years, making each passing fight of his that much harder to watch. Johnny Hendricks. Some fighters' declines are ugly simply because of how frustrating they are to watch. And for the once great former champion of the UFC welterweight division, Johnny Hendricks, his own fall from grace had people scratching their heads more than anything else. Whether it was a dip in motivation, bad luck, the presence of USADA, or anything in between, Hendricks just fell off in a very dramatic way after losing his 170-pound title to Robbie Lawler. Seriously, where he was once an explosive wrestler with incredible one-shot power, he later looked flat, uninspired, and barely able to keep his opponents off of him. Coupled with consistent issues with making weight, he eventually attempted to change his fortunes by moving up to 185 pounds, where he scored a debut victory over Hector Lombard, and for a time it looked as though Big Rig's fortunes were set to change. However, that time was as short as can be, and sure enough, after missing weight again and losing twice in a row by brutal stoppage, Hendricks decided enough was enough and retired from mixed martial arts. Upon reaching his first shot at UFC gold with a stellar record of 15-1, he would go on to lose 7 of his final 10 professional bouts, leaving the octagon behind him after a severe dip in form. The Johnny Hendricks story is a strange one, because in reality, it wasn't as if it was a gradual decline. It seemed like he drastically changed overnight, coming into his next bout without his fighting spirit or that one-hitter-quitter power that had defined his best years. An oddity, that's for sure. Tyron Woodley. On the subject of welterweight champions who couldn't sustain their greatness, Tyron Woodley, to his credit, had a far more impressive title reign than the aforementioned Hendricks, beating some of the greatest 170-pound fighters of his era to extend his number of defenses to 3. The problem? When the unstoppable force that was Kamaru Usman finally reached the top of the welterweight pile, Woodley could do very little to stop him from comprehensively beating him down over 5 rounds to steal away his title. Losing to a fighter of Usman's quality is nothing to be ashamed of, but subsequent defeats to Colby Covington, Gilbert Burns, and Vicente Luque showed Woodley wilting to a very serious extent. Obviously, he was always prone to lapses in activity, as he leaned too heavily on his desire to be tactical and patient. But in these fights, it can't even be said that Tyron was doing that. He just looked gun-shy, uncertain of himself, and unwilling to take the same risks that served up his finest moments during his time as champion. After losing 16 consecutive rounds inside the octagon, as you would expect, Dana White was quick to give this once great champion his marching orders. Thankfully, a dip into the world of YouTube boxing saw the Chosen One net a career-high payday shortly after, as he stepped into the squared circle to take on Jake Paul. So it ain't all bad, it seems. Ronda Rousey. Next up, we have the fighter who wrote the manual on being a sore loser, the former UFC bantamweight champion and all-round pioneer of women's MMA, Ronda Rousey. Looking back on it now, it's crazy to think just how much of a global sensation Rousey actually was. Accepted by fans of this sport and the mainstream media in equal measure, when she wasn't making appearances on primetime television chat shows, she was breaking records inside the cage with stunning submissions. To put it simply, Ronda Rousey was a born winner, a natural competitor who kicked the doors of the UFC wide open and forced Dana White to allow a female presence in the world's premier mixed martial arts promotion. The problem with this undeniably gifted athlete was that she had absolutely no idea how to handle a loss. And when that loss finally came, boy, it was a bad one. Holly Holm exposed the limited striking skills of the Rowdy One for the world to see, comprehensively beating her down over 2 rounds before KOing her with the most iconic head kick in the history of the sport. Indeed, she tried to make a return, this time to take on the newly crowned Amanda Nunes at UFC 207, but Nunes was another beast entirely, battering the former champ to a TKO victory within 1 minute of the opening bell. And though a congratulations and a handshake would have helped Ronda's reputation, her refusal to talk about this defeat in interviews only served to make her into something of a laughingstock within the sports community. Very few fighters have risen as high as this Octagon legend, but none have taken a fall quite as hard. BJ Penn. And finally, we come to one of MMA history's most misunderstood legacies. Sure, if you lived through the best years of the former 2-weight world champion BJ Penn, you'll understand why his decline was so difficult to watch. But by the time a lot of this sport's newer fans came around, this Hall of Famer was already in the midst of a terrible fall from grace. Penn's best years came between his debut in 2001 and the far end of his title contention in 2009, a time that saw him well and truly put the 155-pound division on the map, before then eventually climbing up to 170 with even more success. The problem with the prodigy's career as a whole is that he just never stopped fighting, losing 9 of his last 11 fights inside the octagon with just 1 lone win to show for a decade's worth of competition. Time and time again, the MMA fanbase would collectively hope and pray that this Hawaiian fight icon would just call it a day and leave his legacy as it stood. But between his inability to find his form and some persistent personal issues making the headlines, by the time he was finally released from the UFC in 2019, it was pretty clear that some major damage had been done. As gifted a fighter as the UFC Octagon has ever seen, one would hope that the history books focus more on the earlier portion of his career than the more chaotic period that followed it. A favorite of the fans and one of the standout talents of his era.